I wanted to switch and move over now to Mark Rowlinson, who's with the United Steelworkers and chair of Blue Green Canada, to talk a little bit about the steel industry. We have a question in which is about why we wouldn't do more in terms of domestic steel production, particularly given the emissions associated with transport of steel. So there's a clear advantage to making it at home, which I'm sure you'd agree with. Can you talk about what you think the prospects are for decarbonized steel and what you need to happen for that to take place?
Sure. Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me just first say, I think we need to start by at least acknowledging that Canada has not been especially good at promoting the growth of manufacturing over the last number of decades. I think we have to acknowledge that. So Ralph mentioned at the outset that currently manufacturing is about 10% of GDP. That is down from 16% of GDP a mere 20 years ago in 2000. We've seen a similar loss in the number of jobs connected to manufacturing in Canada from about 16% of the total workforce, again, 20 years ago, to about 9% today. And that doesn't have to be that way. If you compare us to Germany, where in fact manufacturing percent of GDP rose by about 60% over the last over a similar time period. However, one of the things that people have to become aware of as a result of the pandemic is that there are limitations to not having a domestic manufacturing facility. Diana mentioned at the outset that it has become apparent that, how quickly we can spin manufacturing around to manufacture medical equipment. And we also, in Canada, observed to some extent an inability to have a sufficient domestic manufacturing capacity for manufacturing medical equipment. So that has at least brought the issue to light. And I do think that going forward, Canada is actually well placed to develop an advanced manufacturing sector, but it will only do so if we have a plan in both government and the private sector to actually do so. So let me talk a little bit about steel as an example. The Canadian steel industry is amongst the most low carbon steel industries in the world, as Chris mentioned. The Canadian Steel Producers Association has in fact recently committed by 2050. We have a couple of advantages. One is we have a relatively low carbon source electricity grid in most parts of the country. We also have a substantial component of the Canadian steel industry operates on the basis of electric arc furnaces. Just by way of background, there are basically two ways of making steel. One is by melting scrap using electric arc furnace. The other is by making basic steel by combining essentially iron ore and carbon in a blast furnace. And a lot of the Canadian steel industry is electric arc furnaces. But going forward, we will need to make substantial investments in our steel industry if we're going to actually be able to decarbonize it. One technology that I know the steel industry globally is very interested in is replacing the carbon that currently is sourced from metallurgical coal with hydrogen. And there are already pilot projects in Germany and Sweden that are being built to actually technology. What concerns me is that I don't see similar investments being made in Canada. And I think that the Canadian government needs to actually look seriously at doing everything it can to invest, because while our steel industry is low carbon, it's also relatively old. We haven't had a new steel mill built in this country since the late 70s. And they can be retrofitted, and they have been retrofitted, but over time, be a concern. If you compare steel to, for example, aluminum, I won't talk a great deal about aluminum, but just to say on the aluminum front, we also have, by bar none, the lowest carbon aluminum industry in the world. Again, almost entirely due to low carbon electricity in Quebec and British Columbia. And you're already seeing in Quebec a Rio Tinto project to develop zero carbon aluminum being developed in Quebec. So again, on the aluminum front, we're actually ahead of where we are on the steel industry in terms of developing low carbon heavy industry. So lastly, I just want to talk about what are some of the barriers that we face in steel and in aluminum to developing a true low carbon economy of the future. the first barrier I just want to identify is that both steel and actually aluminum continue to be plagued by enormous overcapacity in the global market. And that global overcapacity largely comes from China, which is an extremely high carbon producer of both steel and aluminum. And as Chris mentioned, unless we figure out some way to price carbon emissions into the global price of steel and aluminum, it is going to continue to not be economic for large steel companies to make investments in a jurisdiction like Canada. The second barrier we face, and this has been raised before, but I think we need to talk seriously about our domestic stimulus and specifically government procurement. We do not do well when it comes to ensuring that Canadian government procurement, whether that's in bridges or transit, all of which use a lot of steel and aluminum, we need to make sure and do everything we can to ensure that those markets are created for domestic steel and aluminum using government procurement. And that may mean revisiting some of the provisions we have in current trade agreements and some of the provisions in the WTO General Agreement on Procurement. So those are we need to grow our domestic market, and we need to ensure that our domestic market is fairly protected from unfair trading practices as a result of global overcapacity. So I'll just end there quickly, and I look forward to discussions and questions.